By morning, everything had already changed, and a Miss Marple mystery a welcome, from candlelight mystery welcome back to candlelight mystery, where the darkness speaks in whispers and the truth hides not in shadows but in plain sight. Tonight we offer you a story born from the quietest kind of horror, the kind that wears a Sunday hat and nods to you over the garden wall. This is a tale of an English village where morning came and found the world irrevocably altered, though no one could say precisely when it changed. There is a letter, old and patient. There is a woman who notices things. And there is a secret that has waited decades to breathe. Settle in. Pour your tea. Let the fire speak low. By morning, everything had already changed, and Miss Marple, as ever, had already begun to understand why. Chapter 1. The village of Little Witchford had a particular way of announcing itself in late October, not through any spectacle of colour or noise, but through a quiet withdrawal, as though the land itself had decided to hold its breath. The elms along the high street had shed their last amber leaves some days before, and now stood bare and dark against a sky that could not make up its mind between pewter and ash. The mornings had grown cold with a swiftness that surprised even those who had lived through 60 such autumns here, and by 4:30 in the afternoon the lights were coming on in the cottages, warm and amber through old glass, throwing soft trapezoids across the lane. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the window of Lavender Cottage at the far edge of the village, observed all of this with the particular contentment of a woman who has learned that watching is its own form of thinking. She had arrived in Little Wickford 3 weeks prior as a guest of her old acquaintance Mrs. Edith Fellows, whose cottage sat at the junction where Church Lane met the older unpaved track that wound eventually into the fields beyond. Mrs. Fellows had written to Miss Marple in August, expressing in her methodical way both a general invitation and a specific hope that Miss Marple might come for the harvest festival and stay through to November if her health permitted. The air in Little Wickford was, Mrs. Fellows maintained, restorative Miss Marple, who found the air of St. Mary Mead perfectly satisfactory, but who had no particular objection to variety, had accepted. Little Wickford was not so very different from St. Mary Mead in the essentials. There was the church, St. Crispin's, with its Norman tower and its tendency to let rain in through the north transept. There was a village shop that served also as the post office, and on certain afternoons the informal clearing-house for every piece of news that moved through the community. There was a public house, the Ferryman's Arms, in which the men of the village gathered with a loyalty that no other institution quite commanded. There were 6 larger houses on the outskirts: Hartley Hall, Wickford Grange, the Rectory, Meadow House, and 2 others referred to simply as the Old Vicarage and the Briars, and perhaps 40 cottages of varying sizes clustered along the high street and the 2 lanes that fed into it. There was a war memorial and a duck pond and a post box painted the deep pillar box red that Miss Marple associated with reliability and continuity. She had observed the church on her second morning, which was a Sunday, and had attended the 8 o'clock service rather than the 10 o'clock family one, because the earlier service had smaller attendance, and smaller attendance meant the remaining faces were the devoted and habitual ones, the people for whom worship was not social, but essential. There were 9 of them. She had noted them all. There was Mr. Ramsden alone without his wife, which suggested either that Mrs. Ramsden was unwell, or that she attended the later service for reasons of visibility. There was Mrs. Drummond, who prayed with her eyes wide open, a habit that Miss Marple had always found entirely understandable. There was a young woman she didn't recognise, who cried at the offertory and tried to conceal it, and there was Robert Hartley, kneeling with the particular rigidity of someone for whom the posture of penitence comes easily if not naturally, who received communion last and stood for a moment after the rail was cleared with his head bowed and his hands at his sides, very still, before he turned and walked back to his pew. Miss Marple had noted that stillness. What set Little Witchford somewhat apart, and what Miss Marple had noticed within her first day, was the quality of its social architecture. St. Mary Mead had its layers, certainly, its old families and new arrivals, its unspoken rivalries and its surface courtesies, but Little Witchford seemed to have refined these layers into something almost crystalline. Everyone here had their place, and everyone knew it, and the knowing was not oppressive, but simply structural. It was the grammar of the place, the arrangement by which everything held together. Or so it appeared. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime reading the grammar beneath the grammar, was already finding certain sentences in that structure that did not quite pass. The Fellows' household was a comfortable one. Mrs. Edith Fellows, widowed for 12 years, kept a good table and a warm fire, and a garden that in summer was apparently exceptional, though Miss Marple could now only imagine it through the evidence of the spent rose canes and the bare beds that stretched behind the cottage. Mrs. Fellows had one daughter, Caroline, who was 26 and worked at the solicitor's office in the nearby market town of Oxbury, cycling the 3 miles in fine weather and accepting lifts in foul. There was also a daily woman, Mrs. Pritchard, who came for 4 hours each morning, and whose opinions on every subject were both comprehensive and freely given. It was Mrs. Pritchard who first mentioned the blue letter. Miss Marple had been sitting at the kitchen table on her 6th morning in the village, ostensibly engaged with her knitting, but in fact attending with considerable concentration to Mrs. Pritchard's account of the previous evening's events at the Women's Institute, when the daily woman paused in her polishing of the bread bin and produced from her apron pocket a long envelope of distinctive pale blue. She set it on the table with the air of someone laying down a piece of evidence. "That came for Mr. Hartley," she said. "Delivered to us by mistake young Kevin at the post office, not the regular man. He gets the lanes confused still. I've set it aside to take round, but I wanted you to see the handwriting. Mrs. Fellows had looked at it briefly and said it was none of their business, and it should be taken round directly. But Miss Marple, who had looked at it too, had noted several things. The handwriting on the envelope was old-fashioned in a way that suggested the writer was at least in their 60s, possibly older. The postmark was blurred but appeared to be domestic. And the name on the front, Mr. R., Hartley Hall, Little Wickford, had been written with a certain pressure, as though the sender had felt something quite forceful about the act of addressing it. She had said nothing, and had returned to her knitting, and the letter had been collected by Caroline Fellows on her way to Oxbury that same morning, she being the one to pass closest to Hartley Hall. But Miss Marple had thought about the letter at intervals throughout the day, in the particular way she had of returning to small things that presented themselves as larger things in disguise. The bread bin had continued to be polished. Mrs. Pritchard had continued to speak, moving from the Women's Institute to the question of the new flooring in the church hall, to the matter of Petra Doyle's new hive that had caused a dispute with old Mr. Perrin, whose garden adjoined hers. Miss Marple had listened, and nodded, and asked the occasional gentle question that opened doors rather than closing them, and by the end of the morning she had assembled a thorough map of the village's concerns, its alliances, its small ongoing conflicts. It was the map she always assembled in the first days of any new place, and she assembled it not from vanity or nosiness, but from the same instinct a sailor has for knowing where the rocks are before the weather comes. Hartley Hall was the grandest of the 6 outlying houses, though not large by the standards of a previous century. It was Georgian, square-fronted, with a copper beech in the garden that still held the last of its dark red leaves, like a man reluctant to surrender the last of his dignity. The house belonged to Mr. Robert Hartley, who was 61, a retired solicitor from Bristol, a widower of some 4 years, and a man whom Little Wickford regarded with considerable esteem. He had lived here full-time for 2 years, having spent the prior decades as a weekend and holiday visitor only. He was on the parish council. He had donated the new Lyke Gate at St. Crispin's. He was, Mrs. Pritchard had told Miss Marple with great emphasis, a real gentleman, the old sort, the proper sort. Miss Marple had met him twice, once at the Harvest Festival, where he had been polite, attentive, and rather too careful in his social movements, too precisely the right degree of interested, too exactly the appropriate measure of warm, and once in the village shop, where he had held the door for her with a graciousness that she had returned with a smile and a very careful look at his eyes. His eyes were watchful. People called this intelligence, and it might well be. But watchfulness was not always the same thing as intelligence. Sometimes it was the look of a person who needed to know what others had seen. She had noted both these things and said nothing about either. In the evenings after supper, when Mrs. Fellows settled with her library book, and the fire settled too into its deeper stage of burning, Miss Marple sometimes thought about the village in its entirety, not any one person or any one thread, but the whole of it, the way it hung together, the tensions she had noticed, and those she had not yet located. She thought about the way places accumulate their histories, layer upon layer, and how the surface of a community is always exactly that, a surface, held in place by what is beneath it, shaped by it, sometimes cracking along the lines of the subterranean pressure below. She had not yet found the crack in Little Wickford, but she was patient. She had found them in other places. They always presented themselves eventually, and they always, on examination, turned out to have been present all along, visible to anyone who looked at the right angle. On her 10th day in Little Wickford, Miss Marple attended the Tuesday morning coffee gathering at the home of Mrs. Sylvia Ramsden, who occupied the Briars with her husband Geoffrey, and who served as the social coordinator of the village with an efficiency that made the Women's Institute meetings seem spontaneous by comparison. There were 7 women present: Mrs. Ramsden, Mrs. Fellows, a young woman named Petra Doyle, who had moved to the village 18 months ago and who kept bees, an older woman named Mrs. Alice Drummond, who lived in one of the High Street cottages and who had grown up in Little Witchford and knew its history the way a doctor knows an old patient, a woman named Margaret Croft, who was the rector's wife and who had a talent for saying one thing while meaning another that Miss Marple found both technically admirable and personally trying. And 2 women Miss Marple had not yet properly met, a Mrs. Jean Hartley, who was the sister-in-law of Robert Hartley, having been the wife of his younger deceased brother, and who had recently returned to the village after a long absence, and a woman introduced simply as Dorothy, who was Mrs. Drummond's niece, staying for the month. The Ramsdens' sitting room was the kind of room that told you quite precisely what its owners wished you to know about them: good quality furnishings, carefully maintained, with just enough of the individual touch a painting from a foreign holiday, a vase that was slightly too bold for the rest of the colour scheme to suggest that the occupants were not merely conventional, but had made peace with. Convention as an informed choice. Mrs. Ramsden herself had the quality of someone who makes excellent decisions about everything and knows it, which is a useful quality in a village social organiser and can occasionally produce a certain thinness of sympathy. It was John Hartley who drew Miss Marple's attention most thoroughly that morning. She was 53, dark-haired still, with very little grey, slim and quietly dressed, in a way that suggested care without vanity. She said almost nothing for the first half of the gathering. She accepted her coffee and held it without drinking. She smiled when smiled at. But her eyes, when Miss Marple had occasion to observe them unguarded in the brief moment when Mrs. Ramsden turned to fuss with the milk jug, were the eyes of someone enduring something. The talk that morning was pleasant and unremarkable for the most part. It touched on the church roof fund, on the question of whether the village should have a Christmas fair, on Mrs. Drummond's hip, which had been troublesome, on the excellence of Petra Doyle's honey. And then, in the way of village conversation, it found its way to Robert Hartley. "He's looking rather thin," said Mrs. Croft, with the rector's wife's precise emphasis on looking rather than being. "I mentioned it to Geoffrey, and he said he'd call in." "He's been distracted," said Mrs. Ramsden, with the authority of one who has gathered intelligence thoroughly. "He had a letter last week that seemed to set him off. You know how he gets all closed in on himself." Miss Marple's needles kept their rhythm. Jean Hartley's coffee cup did not move. "I expect it was business," said Mrs. Fellows comfortably. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Ramsden in a tone that did not entirely agree. Miss Marple said, in her most pleasantly conversational voice, "Such a handsome house. Hartley Hall. I understand it's been in the family quite some time?" "Oh, generations," said Mrs. Drummond, who welcomed any invitation to history. "The Hartleys have been here since at least the 1890s. Robert's grandfather built the Copper Beech. If you can believe it, planted it as a sapling. Robert's father was born there, as was Robert himself." "And his brother?" said Miss Marple, making the inquiry in the same tone she might have inquired about the weather. There was a pause, very brief, barely perceptible. "Martin was born there too," said Mrs. Drummond, "but he was away most of his life. Different sort." Jean Hartley set her coffee cup down very quietly on its saucer. "Yes," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "Martin was different." Miss Marple looked at her knitting and thought about the blue letter, and about the handwriting on it, and about Robert Hartley's watchful eyes. On the walk home, she paused on the bridge over the small stream that ran below the churchyard. Nothing dramatic, barely a brook, but with a particular sound of moving water that she had always found conducive to thought, and she considered what she knew. The village had its respectabilities and its courtesies and its careful arrangements, and underneath all of that there was something held tightly in place, something that Jean Hartley endured at coffee mornings, something that had made Robert Hartley go very still after receiving a pale blue letter. The central object had made itself known to her, though she had not yet seen it whole. She had seen only its shadow, a long pale blue envelope on a polished table, and already she was beginning to understand its shape. She stayed later than the others that morning, helping Mrs. Ramsden collect the cups, and in those extra 10 minutes she learned 2 additional things. One was that Martin Hartley had died 6 years ago of heart failure. The other was that before his death, he and Robert had not spoken for nearly 20 years. She walked home through the bare lanes in the flat October light with her knitting bag over her arm, and she thought about brothers who did not speak, and letters that unsettled, and a woman who endured something in a room full of comfortable talk. She thought about these things in the careful, unhurried way she thought about everything, which was to say she thought about them in the way one does when one suspects they matter greatly and are not yet understood, but will be. Chapter 2. The death at Hartley Hall. The finding of Robert Hartley's body was, in the language of Little Wickford, an event that people would divide their memories around for years afterward. Those who had been in the village before it, and those who had arrived after it, would carry a slightly different village inside them, the way a river valley looks different depending on which side of the dam you are standing when the water changed. He was found on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Miss Marple had observed the blue letter on Mrs. Fellows's kitchen table. He was found by his housekeeper, Mrs. Norma Bassett, who arrived at Hartley Hall at 8 o'clock as she always did, let herself in with her key, and found the kitchen empty and the kettle cold. This in itself was unremarkable, Mr. Hartley was not always downstairs by 8. What struck her as she went through to the hall was the library door standing open, when he was in the habit of closing it. And what struck her as she approached the open door was the stillness inside it, a stillness of a quality that the living do not produce. Robert Hartley was in his leather armchair by the dead fireplace. He was dressed, which Mrs. Bassett would later emphasize with a peculiar intensity, as though this were the detail that most resisted accommodation, dressed in day clothes, as if he had intended the morning, had prepared himself for it, and sat down to wait for it, and simply not arrived. His hands were folded in his lap with a neatness that was almost studied. His face, she said, had a look of surprise about it, or perhaps of something that had been surprise and had settled into something quieter. The Dr. Fenwick, was there within the hour. He was a careful man of 50, not easily hurried, who had served the village for 20 years and who disliked the theatrics of conclusion. He observed, noted, asked Mrs. Bassett careful questions, and told her that it appeared Mr. Hartley had died of cardiac failure, possibly in the night or very early morning, and that while the death would need to be formally reported, he did not at first examination see any cause for alarm beyond the ordinary tragedy of it. The word spread through Little Wickford with the swiftness particular to villages, carried along the lanes and up through the shop and across the churchyard wall before noon. By the time Miss Marple heard it from Mrs. Pritchard, who had heard it from the woman at the shop, who had heard it from the postman, who had heard it from someone who had driven past Hartley Hall and seen the doctor's car, it had already accumulated the small elaborations of transmission, the additions that sorrow always gathers as it travels. Miss Marple set down her knitting and was still for a moment. Mrs. Fellows, who had heard a minute after Miss Marple, came into the sitting-room with her hands pressed together and her eyes bright with that particular quality of distress that comes not from closeness to the person lost, but from proximity to loss itself. "Poor man," she said, and sat down heavily. "Poor, poor man. To die alone like that." "In his own chair," said Miss Marple gently. "In his own home." "Yes," said Mrs. Fellows, accepting this comfort because it was offered. "Yes, I suppose so." Mrs. Pritchard, still in her apron, leaned against the kitchen door frame with her arms folded and her expression combining genuine sadness with something that was not quite satisfaction, but neighboured it the expression of someone who had anticipated sorrow and finds no pleasure in being right. "They'll find it was his heart," she said. "He had something the matter. The doctor's been to see him twice this year. And he hasn't been right since that letter." "Since what letter?" said Miss Marple, with the air of polite vagueness she sometimes deployed. "Oh, there was some letter came for him 2 weeks ago or so. Knocked him sideways, by all accounts. Mrs. Bassett said he was quite unlike himself after it. Locked himself in the library for a whole afternoon, and Mrs. Bassett said when he came out he looked as though he'd had news of a death." She paused and heard herself. "Well, poor man." Miss Marple said, "These old solicitors do accumulate complicated affairs. I imagine retirement doesn't simplify everything." "No," said Mrs. Pritchard. "No, I don't suppose it does." The afternoon was difficult in the particular way of afternoons when someone in a community has died. People move differently through the village with slightly more purpose, slightly less direction, the cross purposes of those who do not know what to do, but feel they ought to do something. Calls were made. Small dishes of food were considered, and some were prepared. The rector, Mr. Croft, went to Hartley Hall and was admitted. Dr. Fenwick made a second visit. Miss Marple walked out at 2:30, ostensibly for the air, actually because she had found that she thought better in motion. She went along Church Lane, past the light gate that Hartley had donated, and stood for a moment looking at the copper beech, visible over the garden wall of Hartley Hall. The last of its dark red leaves were giving way today in a light wind, falling slowly, each one taking a separate deliberate path down. She watched them for several minutes. She had been thinking about Robert Hartley's death since the moment she heard of it, and she had been thinking about it in the way she thought about all things that presented themselves as simple and felt complex. Dr. Fenwick was a careful man, and she did not doubt his observation. Cardiac failure was a real and common thing. Robert Hartley had been 61 and had been seen twice by the doctor this year. The death was sad, but not on its surface strange. On its surface. But there was the matter of the letter, and there was the matter of Jean Hartley, whose husband had been dead for 6 years, and who had returned to Little Wickford Ware. When? Miss Marple realised she did not know precisely when Jean Hartley had returned. She knew only that she was here now. And there was the matter of the library door, standing open when it was his habit to close it. And there was the matter of his hands, folded in his lap with a neatness that was almost studied. Mrs. Bassett had said that, without appearing to understand what she had said. Miss Marple walked slowly back along the lane, noting the way the cold was settling more decisively now, the way the light was moving lower and more gold, the way the late afternoon had that particular quality of English autumn, immensely beautiful and simultaneously insistent about its own melancholy. She had noticed, in her long life, that melancholy and beauty tended to occupy the same territory in the English landscape, and that each served to intensify the other, which was either very profound or simply the weather. The reaction of the village to the death was instructive in itself. Mrs. Drummond, who knew everything, went quiet in a way that suggested she was fitting things together and did not like the shape they made. The young beekeeper Petra Doyle, who had no history with any of them, seemed genuinely distressed, because she was young and Robert Hartley had been kind to her when she arrived, and loneliness recognises kindness and remembers it. Mrs. Ramsden organised things, as she always did, and in the organising kept her feelings at a safe administrative distance. It was Caroline Fellows who said the thing that settled into Miss Marple's mind like a stone into still water. Caroline had come home from Oxbury at 6 to find the house subdued and the news received, and had stood in the kitchen with her coat still on and her face pale, and said, "I dropped that letter round to him, you know. The one from the post office mistake. I pushed it through his letterbox on my way into work. I wonder if he'd have been better off never getting it." "Why do you say that?" said Miss Marple. Caroline looked at her the look of someone who has said more than they intended. "Oh, only because of what Mrs. Bassett said. About how strange he seemed after. That's all." "Of course," said Miss Marple, but Caroline's eyes had slid sideways as she said "that's all," and people who say that's all when they mean that's enough rarely mean only what they say. Miss Marple went upstairs early that evening. She sat in the chair by the window with no lamp, looking out at the dark lane, and she thought about Robert Hartley and the letter and the hands folded too neatly in the lap. She thought about Jean Hartley, returned from a long absence. She thought about brothers who did not speak for 20 years. She thought, there is something here that is not what it appears to be. She thought, and someone in this village knows it, and is very frightened. The October dark was complete by 5 o'clock now, and the village was very quiet, and somewhere in that quiet a door closed, and then another, and then there was nothing but the wind in the bare elms, and the feeling that the morning, when it came, would be different. It was, of course, it always is, after death. But Miss Marple suspected that the difference in this case would be of a particular kind. The kind that comes not from nature's ordinary progressions, but from something a human being has decided to do, and done, and hoped would be mistaken for nature. She sat in the dark and she was very still, which was her way of being most alert, and she thought about all of it until Mrs. Fellows tapped gently at her door to ask if she would like a cup of Ovaltine. She said yes, she rather thought she would. And she came downstairs, and they sat together by the fire, and she listened to Mrs. Fellows talk about Robert Hartley, the small, fond things she remembered, and she listened with genuine sympathy, and also with the other part of her attention, the part that could not be turned off, noting every small thing. Jean Hartley, Mrs. Fellows mentioned, had been to see Dr. Fenwick late that afternoon, to be told the news properly, as next of kin. She had seemed, Mrs. Fellows thought, very composed. Miss Marple had known women who were very composed in the face of deaths they had expected. She drank her Ovaltine, and said nothing, and thought considerably. Chapter 3. What Martin knew the past, in Miss Marple's experience, was never as past as people wished it to be. It persisted in objects and in habits, and in the faces of those who had survived it, and it had a tendency to surface at the worst possible moments, which was perhaps another way of saying that it surfaced at the most necessary ones. She thought about Jean Hartley all that night in the fitful way of someone who is not exactly asleep, but is not exactly awake either, and by morning she had assembled what she knew into a shape that was still incomplete, but was beginning to have edges. She needed to understand the brothers. She needed to understand what had separated them so thoroughly for 20 years that their estrangement had become a known and accepted fact in the village, like the church roof and the duck pond unremarkable by its constancy. Mrs. Drummond was the right person for this. Miss Marple arranged to call on Mrs. Drummond on the pretext of returning a book she had borrowed a village history at the Tuesday gathering, and found the older woman in her sitting room with a rug over her legs and a cup of tea, and the air of someone who had been waiting, if not specifically for Miss Marple. Then for the opportunity that Miss Marple represented. "I knew them both," said Mrs. Drummond. When Miss Marple had been given tea and settled, and the book had been disposed of, and the conversational bridge to the Hartley brothers crossed with minimal effort. Knew them as boys. Martin was younger by 4 years, so Robert would have been 12 or 13 when Martin was 8 or 9. Robert was always the steady one, their father's sort. Martin was different, as I said. Brighter, perhaps, or more complicated. He felt things more. Miss Marple set down her cup. "And they were close as boys?" "Very," said Mrs. Drummond, with a definiteness that suggested she had thought about this. "Very close in the way that people are, when there's a real difference between them, not despite the difference. Because of it. Robert was the anchor, Martin was the weather. They needed each other. What changed? Mrs. Drummond was quiet for a moment that was not the quiet of someone choosing what to say so much as someone choosing how to say it. There was a young woman, she said. There usually is, isn't there, when brothers fall out. A woman named Dorothy Hale, no relation to the Dorothy who's visiting at the moment. Different family entirely. This was 30 years ago or more. She was from Oxbury, worked at a solicitor's there, not Robert's firm, a different one. She came to the village for a summer, renting a room from old Mrs. Perkins, who used to have the cottage at the top of the lane. Martin was 23 or 24 at the time. He fell in love with her quite absolutely. Miss Marple remembered in that particular way she had, as though remembering were a form of inhabiting. She remembered a summer that felt like this one's distant ancestor, warm and long and full of unspoken things. She remembered what it was to be 23 and to fall absolutely. Martin Hartley, in that summer, had been a young man of some promise. He had finished his degree at Bristol and was considering a career in journalism. He was quick and observant and wrote well, his old schoolmaster had always said. He had come back to Little Witchford for that particular summer, because their father was unwell and Robert had asked him to come, and because this was the part that mattered. He had wanted to. He had wanted the lanes and the fields and the slow evenings after dinner when the garden light was gold and the swallows stitched the air above the lawn. He had wanted home. He had found Dorothy Hale instead, or she had found him. It is difficult after 30 years to assign the directional grammar of such things. She had arrived in the village on a Saturday in June, with a bicycle and a canvas bag, and a face that was not conventionally pretty, but was alive in the way that makes conventional prettiness seem beside the point. She was 22. She worked in a solicitor's office in Oxbury, and she was spending her summer taking a room in Mrs. Perkins's cottage while she considered what her life was to be, which is a reasonable thing to do at 22, particularly in the kind of summer that Little Wickford produced in those years long and warm and generous with light. She had come with 2 books and a sketchbook and the tentative plan of drawing the church and the fields and the duck pond, which she did, and which was how Martin Hartley first saw her, sitting on the churchyard wall with her sketchbook on her knee and her face turned upward into the late afternoon sun, with the uncomplicated joy of someone who has taken themselves somewhere beautiful and knows it. He had stopped on the lane. He had looked at her for rather longer than was strictly justified by the requirements of noticing a person. She had looked back, and had not looked away first, which told him something. He had said good afternoon. She had said it back, and had shown him the sketch, and it was good, genuinely good, with the confident line of someone who has trained her eye without having trained her hand into formality. He had said so honestly, not in the way of young men performing admiration, but in the way of someone recognizing quality and being pleased by it. She had been pleased that he noticed the difference. They had walked. They had talked. He had taken her to the Ferryman's Arms on a Tuesday evening, and to the harvest dance in the village hall the following Saturday, and the village had noticed and been pleased, because they were both well liked and made a handsome pair, and such things in a village are small pleasures that cost nothing. Robert had noticed too, and had been pleased, and had had Dorothy to dinner at Hartley Hall, and their father, still well enough then to come downstairs in the evenings, had been charmed by her. Robert had been charmed by her too, though this was the part that would only become clear later, in retrospect when the pattern could be seen whole. He had been charmed in the way that he was always charmed by things that belonged to Martin, the books Martin read, the causes Martin admired, the particular quality of Martin's attention, which picked things out of the world and illuminated them. Robert was the steadier, the more reliable, the more conventionally equipped for life's requirements. He was also the one who had always, in the quiet depths of the fraternal arithmetic, understood himself to be the less interesting, and had made his peace with this through the cultivation of usefulness and respectability. But peace is not the same as indifference, and there were things Robert Hartley had wanted that he had never allowed himself to want openly. There was a letter that existed in that story, though it was not the blue letter of 2 weeks ago. It was a letter that Martin had written to Dorothy in September of that summer, a letter of some length and considerable feeling, in which he had this was the part that Mrs. Drummond knew only in its general outline, having had it from Mrs. Perkins, who had had it from Dorothy herself in the disordered aftermath in which he had declared himself entirely, not only his love, but his plans, his intentions, his hope of a future in which she was constant and central. He had given this letter to Robert to deliver. Robert had delivered nothing. Miss Marple was very still in her chair, as still as she sometimes became when something large and old arranged itself behind something small and present. "He gave it to Robert?" she said. "He had to leave for 2 days. Some matter with his father's affairs had to go to Bristol. He gave the letter to Robert and asked him to put it in Dorothy's hand. Robert said he would." Mrs. Drummond set down her cup. Whether he did or not is something only the two of them ever knew. But Dorothy left the village before Martin came back, went back to Oxbury, and then further on she went to London eventually, and I lost track of her, and Martin came home to find her gone, and no explanation, and Robert saying only that she'd left without word. Miss Marple thought about this. And Martin believed him? For a while. Then I'm not certain of the exact sequence, mind. I only know what reached me eventually, but I believe Martin spoke to Mrs. Perkins before she died. This was perhaps 10 years later, and something of what Mrs. Perkins said made him suspect that Dorothy had never received the letter, or had received something else instead. The room was very quiet. Through Mrs. Drummond's window the November sky was flat and white, and the beech tree at the gate had gone completely bare. He confronted Robert? I believe so, and Robert well. I don't know what Robert said. What I know is that after that, they didn't speak. Martin married Jean. They'd known each other from university. She'd been a friend of Dorothy's, interestingly enough, which I've always found well. He lived in Bristol, then Edinburgh, then Glasgow. Robert stayed here. Their father died and left the house to Robert, as the elder, which was perhaps not fair to Martin, but was the kind of not fair that families often arrange without meaning to. Martin came back only for the funeral, and not at all after. Miss Marple thought. The letter. The blue letter of 2 weeks ago. Martin had been dead for 6 years. But what would Martin have possessed, in his life, that might surface after his death, travel through a probate process or an estate clearing, and eventually arrive in a blue envelope in an old hand, a hand that suggested someone of considerable age at Hartley Hall? She thought Jean Hartley had returned to Little Wickford. She thought Jean had been a friend of Dorothy Hale. She thought the letter Robert had been meant to deliver 30 years ago. What had happened to it? She walked home through the white November light with her knitting bag and her thoughts, and she was beginning to understand the shape of the thing, though she did not yet know whether the death was natural or something else. And she reminded herself, firmly and with great discipline, that she did not know this yet. She must not decide what she knew, she must only know what she knew. What she knew was this, that there was an old wrong at the centre of this, old and buried. That Robert Hartley had done something to his brother 30 years ago, something that had shaped Martin's entire life, his marriage, his exile. That a letter had been sent to Robert recently that had disturbed him profoundly, and that Robert had died, alone in his library, with his hands folded too neatly. She thought, I must speak to Jean Hartley. She thought, I must do so carefully and soon. And she thought, there is something else, something I am not yet seeing, something that connects the blue letter to the death in a way I have not yet traced. She was nearly at Mrs. Fellows's gate when she stopped. Jean Hartley had been a friend of Dorothy Hale's. Jean Hartley had married Martin Hartley. Jean Hartley had, presumably, known what Martin suspected of his brother. And Jean Hartley was here. Not in Bristol, not in Edinburgh, not at a safe distance. Here, in Little Wickford, in the autumn, at Hartley Hall's neighbouring village, attending Tuesday coffee mornings, watching with enduring eyes. Miss Marple went inside and sat down and picked up her knitting, and was for several minutes not knitting at all. Chapter 4. Evidence in its absence, Dr. Fenwick signed the death certificate on Friday morning. Cardiac failure. He told the rector when they met at the Lyke Gate. No reason to suspect anything else, and every reason to believe it. The history of arterial trouble, the age, the physique. Robert Hartley had been a man who ate well and worked little and worried. By the evidence of recent months, considerably, that combination, said Dr. Fenwick, was not an uncommon road to the end. Miss Marple heard this from Mrs. Fellows, who had heard it from the rector's wife. She received it with her usual placid expression, and said that it was sad, but perhaps not surprising. And then she asked, in the way of mild and general inquiry, whether Dr. Fenwick had found anything else of note during his examination, whether Mr. Hartley had perhaps had a drink or taken a sleeping draught, anything of that nature. Mrs. Fellows looked mildly surprised. I shouldn't think so. Why would he? No reason, said Miss Marple, pleasantly. I only wondered if he'd had difficulty sleeping. Some people do, when they're troubled. Mrs. Bassett did say he'd been off his food, offered Mrs. Fellows. She mentioned he'd hardly touched his supper the last few nights, and he had a glass of brandy most evenings, apparently, which he wasn't in the habit of before. Miss Marple noted this. Brandy taken regularly when it was not habitual could be a comfort, or it could be a delivery mechanism if one had access to a certain knowledge of pharmacology and to Robert Hartley's routine. She noted it and said nothing, because she still did not know enough, and she was aware that she was reasoning toward a conclusion she had not yet earned. She went on Friday afternoon to the village shop on the pretext of stamps, and while there managed a conversation with the shopkeeper, Mr. Baines, who was a small, alert man with the shopkeeper's comprehensive knowledge of the village's purchasing habits. She did not ask about anything directly, but allowed the conversation to move, as it would, through the mild channels of post-Hartley discussion, and in the course of it learned two things. One, that Jean Hartley had been in the shop twice in the past week, purchasing items that included, among other things, a bottle of aspirin and a small glass bottle of a proprietary sleeping remedy. Two, that Jean Hartley had, on her most recent visit, asked Mr. Baines whether he happened to know the schedule of the regular postman, the one who usually served the hall. The second item was the one that lodged. Why would Jean Hartley need to know the postman's schedule? Letters were delivered. One waited for them, or one did not. Unless one were interested in the question of when, precisely, a letter might have arrived, or when it might have been taken. Miss Marple went home and did some very careful thinking. The blue letter, she had seen it on the table on a Monday. It had been delivered by the substitute postman. Caroline had taken it round to Hartley Hall on Tuesday morning. Robert Hartley had been, by Mrs. Bassett's account, significantly distressed after receiving it. He had died on Wednesday night or Thursday morning. The interval between receipt of the letter and death was approximately 2 days. She did not know what was in the letter. She knew only that it had come from someone whose handwriting suggested age, and that it had Robert's name written on it with a kind of force. She thought it could have been from someone who knew what Robert had done 30 years ago. It could have been, in the most plausible construction, from someone who had known Dorothy Hale, or from Dorothy Hale herself. She would be in her 50s now. The handwriting had seemed older than that, but Miss Marple knew that people's handwriting sometimes aged faster than they did, and sometimes held the habits of an earlier generation. She thought, where is that letter now? It had gone to Hartley Hall. Robert had received it. Robert was dead. His papers, his correspondence, his library, where were these things? Who would manage his estate? She did not know, and this frustrated her, because the letter was the key, and its absence from her knowledge was a significant gap. There was also the matter of what Miss Marple thought of privately as the secondary evidence, not the letter itself, but the traces around it. She had been considering these in the careful way she had, arranging them in order of significance. The sleeping remedy that Jean had purchased. The inquiry about the postman's schedule. The fact of Jean's presence in the village since September, not since after Robert's death, but before it, well before it, as though she had come for a purpose that preceded any death. None of this was conclusive, and Miss Marple was very strict with herself about the difference between a suggestive pattern and a conclusion. She had, in her long experience, been misled by suggestive patterns before, had followed the shape of a thing, and found the substance different from the shadow. She reminded herself of this. She held the facts she had, and refused to allow them to become more than facts. The following morning Saturday brought a development that she had not entirely expected, though in retrospect perhaps she should have. Mrs. Bassett came to Mrs. Fellows's door. She was agitated in the controlled way of a woman who has been agitated for some time and has been managing it with effort. And she wanted to speak to Miss Marple specifically, having heard from Mrs. Pritchard, naturally that Miss Marple had a reputation for these sorts of things. Miss Marple brought her into the sitting room and gave her tea and waited. "The library," said Mrs. Bassett. "I went in yesterday afternoon to begin putting things in order it needed to be done, and I wasn't sure when the solicitor would come, and I thought I should at least have it decent. And I noticed Mr. Hartley kept his desk very particular, you understand. Very neat. Everything in its place. I've cleaned that room for 2 years and I know exactly how he kept it." "Yes," said Miss Marple. His correspondence box, the flat leather one on the right side of the desk. He kept letters in it that he was dealing with, or had recently dealt with. I know it well because I had to dust round it every week and never move it. She paused. It was empty. Miss Marple was still. Empty? Empty, and it hadn't been dusted recently, I mean. There was a faint line in the dust where it had been moved. Moved, and then put back, but in slightly the wrong position. And the wastepaper basket had been emptied, which I hadn't emptied, and I do on Tuesdays, not Thursdays. So someone had been in the library. Someone had taken or destroyed the correspondence in that box. And someone had emptied the wastepaper basket, which might have contained, among other things, an envelope of distinctive pale blue. Miss Marple said, "Did Mr. Hartley have a key to the house beside his own?" "He kept a spare on a hook in the kitchen," said Mrs. Bassett. "He'd had it made for emergencies. He mentioned once that a family member had a copy of the original." She had stopped herself before the name. But the correction was visible, a small grammatical flinch. "Jean Hartley?" said Miss Marple. Gently, Mrs. Bassett looked at her cup. "She is family," she said. "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Of course she is." She saw Mrs. Bassett out and then stood in the hall for a moment, thinking, Jean Hartley had a key to Hartley Hall. Between Robert's death on Wednesday night and Mrs. Bassett's arrival Thursday morning, or even later, before Mrs. Bassett returned on Friday afternoon, there had been time. Quiet, unobserved time, in which someone with a key might enter the library and remove what needed to be removed. But this told Miss Marple something else as well, something that complicated the picture rather than simplifying it. If Jean had removed the letter, it suggested she knew what the letter had contained, which suggested she either had sent it or had known it was sent. And if she had sent it or arranged for it to be sent then, she was not grieving a spontaneous death, but managing the aftermath of something she had set in motion. Miss Marple thought about this for a long time, sitting in the still house while Mrs. Fellows was out at the shop. She thought, there are 2 possibilities. Either Robert Hartley died of cardiac failure brought on by the shock and guilt of what the letter revealed, and Jean then removed the letter to prevent its contents becoming known. Or Robert Hartley was assisted in his dying by someone who then needed to remove the evidence that a motive existed. Both were possible. Both were dreadful. One was murder. She needed to know more about the brandy. She needed to know more about the letter. And she needed, most of all, to speak to Jean Hartley, whose eyes had the look of someone enduring something, which could be grief or guilt or both. She picked up her knitting and held it without working. The village outside was Saturday quiet, the particular quiet of a place that has absorbed a shock and is reconstituting itself around the absence. Somewhere a dog was barking. Somewhere else a car was starting, going away along the lane. Miss Marple thought, by morning everything had already changed. Not just on the morning they found Robert. On a different morning, 30 years ago, when a young woman left a village without a word, and a young man came home to find her gone. Everything had been different by that morning too, and the difference had rippled forward through all the years to this library, this armchair, these folded hands. She was very sad, suddenly, genuinely and thoroughly sad, for Martin, for Dorothy, for the young people they had been when the summer was long and the swallows flew, and there was everything ahead of them, for the years that had been lost, for the marriage Jean had built on the ruins of that loss, and for whatever she had felt, all this time, carrying the knowledge of it. She was sad. And she was also resolved. She would go to Jean Hartley on Monday morning. Chapter 5. The weight of knowing Jean Hartley was staying in one of the village's small letting cottages on the far side of the duck pond Willow End, a narrow lime-washed place that belonged to the Ramsdens and was let to visitors and occasional longer-term tenants. Miss Marple had confirmed this through the quiet mechanism of being Mrs. Fellows's guest, which meant she heard most things eventually. Jean had been there since September 6 weeks before Robert Hartley's death. Miss Marple walked to Willow End on Monday morning at 10 o'clock, carrying a jar of Mrs. Fellows's damson jam as an excuse, though she rather thought the excuse would not be necessary. Jean Hartley, she suspected, had been expecting someone to come. The door opened within seconds of her knock, which suggested she had been near it. Jean was dressed in dark grey trousers and a pale blue jumper. The coincidence of the colour struck Miss Marple momentarily, and her face, in the morning light, was composed, but had the particular translucency of someone who had not slept well. She was 53 and looked it, but looked it in the way of someone who has lived their years rather than merely accumulated them. Miss Marple, she said, and something in her voice was neither warm nor cold but carefully neutral, the voice of someone who has prepared for a conversation and is not quite ready to begin it. "I've brought you some jam," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Fellows makes quite excellent damson. May I come in for a few minutes?" There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds, during which Jean Hartley made some private assessment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. The cottage's sitting room was small and tidy, with the impersonal tidiness of a place that has been inhabited carefully rather than comfortably. There were books stacked on the table, historical things, a biography of someone whose name Miss Marple didn't quite catch. There was a half-finished cup of tea. There was, on the mantelpiece, a framed photograph that Miss Marple allowed herself to register only briefly, without appearing to look at it, and then to process later, a man and a woman, younger. Somewhere with water behind them, a harbour perhaps. The man was not Robert. They sat. Jean poured tea from the pot already on the table. They were both silent for a moment, in the way of two people who are each waiting to see how the other will navigate toward the necessary subject. It was Jean who spoke first, which surprised Miss Marple slightly. "You've been asking questions," Jean said. It was not an accusation, precisely, but it was direct. "I've heard through the village mechanism. Mrs. Drummond, I imagine, and others. You have a reputation." "I'm afraid I do," said Miss Marple. "I don't mean it unkindly. I think perhaps I've been waiting for someone to ask." Jean's hands were around her cup, and the knuckles were white, not from cold. It's a terrible weight, knowing something and not knowing what to do with it. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I should think it would be." Jean looked at her directly for the first time. "You think he was helped to die?" Miss Marple said, with great gentleness, "I think it is possible. I don't know. I'm trying to understand." There was a long silence in which Jean Hartley seemed to arrive at something. Not a decision. It had the feeling of a decision already made earlier, in some private part of the night, but the surface expression of one. "I sent the letter," she said. "The blue one. I should tell you that first. It was mine. I'd found, when I was going through Martin's papers after he died, there was so much to go through, he kept everything a letter. A letter that Dorothy had written to Martin, years after they'd both moved on. She'd heard through someone that Martin was ill. This was 2 years before he died, his first serious heart episode, and she'd written to say she was sorry, and that she'd always wondered about that summer, and that she'd heard the truth of it eventually. She was an old woman by then. She just wanted him to know that she knew, and that she'd never blamed him. that she'd received a letter, but not his letter. A different one, in Robert's handwriting, very brief, saying that Martin had reconsidered and had nothing further to say to her and wished her well. Miss Marple felt something settle quietly in her chest. Not surprise, understanding Robert had written to her pretending to be Martin. To close the door. To send her away without explanation, without the chance to respond, without even the dignity of a real ending. Jean's voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that is achieved through great effort and could fail at any moment. Martin had given him the letter, his own letter, declaring himself, and Robert had kept it and written his own in its place, and Dorothy had thought Martin had simply changed his mind. She'd been 23, she'd gone away, and Martin never knew. Not for 15 years. Then Mrs. Perkins said something, as she was dying the fragment of it, enough to make him go to Robert, demand to know, and Robert admitted it. He said he'd done it for Martin's sake, that Dorothy wasn't right for him, that he'd been protecting him. Jean stopped. Martin never recovered from it. Not really. He married me, and I think he was fond of me, and I believe he tried. But there was something in him that had been broken that summer, before he knew why, and knowing why at last only confirmed the break. The best years of his life had been stolen from him by the person he trusted most in the world. Miss Marple waited. "So you wrote to Robert," she said. "When Martin died, I found Dorothy's letter among his things, and I thought, Robert should know that there is a record, that it is documented, that the letter exists, and that I have it. I thought he deserved to sit with that knowledge for a while, the way Martin had sat with it for 30 years. She paused. I didn't want money. I didn't want anything except for him to know that I knew, and that the concealment was over. That's what I wrote. Miss Marple thought about Robert Hartley in his library, reading this letter. The weight of it. 20 years of silence, and now his brother was dead and his brother's wife was here, in Little Witchford in September, and a letter was coming, and there was no more hiding. When did you go to Hartley Hall? Miss Marple asked. Jean looked at her steadily. On the night he died. The room was very quiet. Tell me, said Miss Marple. I went there at 9 o'clock. I had telephoned earlier, he'd answered, and then hung up when I said my name. I went because I wanted to speak to him. Not to harm him. I want you to believe that. I'm listening, said Miss Marple. He let me in. Or I used the key I'd had since Martin's father's time, the key Robert had given me years ago when Martin and I used to visit, before the estrangement. He was in the library. He'd been drinking. There was a brandy glass and the decanter, and he was sitting in that armchair, and he looked. She stopped. He looked like someone who has run out of road. He looked like a man at an ending. Was he ill when you arrived? The pause was of a kind that told Miss Marple more than words would. He was not well. He was pale, and his breathing was he was clutching the arm of the chair. Jean's voice did not waver, but something behind it did. I thought it was distress. I thought I said what I'd come to say. I said that Martin had died knowing the truth, and that he had died still carrying it, and that I was not going to pursue any course of action. I had no interest in legal proceedings or public exposure. But I wanted him to know that his brother had known. That he hadn't died deceived. And Robert? He tried to speak. He managed a few words, I couldn't hear all of them. He was, and then she stopped fully. He died, said Miss Marple, very quietly. He collapsed forward, and Jean was very still. I sat there for a long time. I didn't know what to do. I could see that he was, and I should have telephoned. I know that, but you didn't. I thought, if I telephoned from there, at that hour there would be questions, and the letter, and all of it would come out. And I thought, it was his heart. I could see it was his heart. And there was nothing to be done. He was already gone. And I thought of Martin and of all the years. And I left. She was looking at her hands now, And you came back the next day and removed the letter from the correspondence box? Yes, and emptied the wastepaper basket. Yes, Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Was there anything in the brandy glass? She asked. Or the decanter? Anything other than brandy? Jean's head came up. No, she said, and the word had a velocity that carried conviction. No, absolutely not. I've been afraid of that question, since it happened, afraid that someone would ask it, and think but no. I am many things in this. I am not that. Miss Marple studied her. Mrs. Hartley, she said. Jean, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, though I suspect you already know the answer. Jean waited. Did you believe, when you came that evening, that the shock of what you were telling him might cause this? Did you know he was unwell, that his heart was weak, that the stress of a confrontation that the silence that followed, was the longest yet? I knew he had a heart condition, Jean said. Mrs. Drummond mentioned it when I arrived in September. I told myself that I was owed this, that Martin was owed this, that the truth deserved to be spoken aloud, regardless of consequence. She paused. But I have been asking myself, every night since Thursday morning, whether I told myself those things because they were true, or because they allowed me to do what I wanted to do without admitting what I was doing. Miss Marple said nothing. I think, said Jean, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, that I knew. I think I told myself I didn't, but I knew. And I went anyway. The fire in the small grate of Willow End crackled quietly. Outside, the duck pond was still and grey, and the bare trees reflected in it were as clear as the real ones, which made it impossible to tell which was which. Miss Marple sat with this for a long time. She thought, this is not the simple case of murder I had been building toward. It is something else, something older and more human and more terrible. A woman who had carried a great wrong for 30 years, and who had found a way to discharge it, and who had told herself it was justice, and who was not entirely wrong. She thought, what does one do with this? She said, tell me again about the moment he collapsed. Tell me everything, and slowly. And Jean told her. And as she listened, Miss Marple heard the truth not of guilt, but of something more complicated, and more human, and in the end more devastating than guilt. She stayed at Willow End for 2 hours that morning. When she left, the duck pond was ruffled by a cold wind that had come in from the north, and the reflections were broken, and you could no longer confuse the trees with their image in the water. She walked home slowly, with her bag over her arm and her thoughts very full, and she did not hurry, because there was no hurry now. The urgency was of a different kind, not the urgency of catching something or preventing something, but the quieter, harder urgency of deciding what truth requires of the living when the dead can no longer be answered. Chapter 6. The architecture of Truth Miss Marple walked home from Willow End in the thin November sunlight at 11:30, and she walked slowly, which people who knew her well would have recognised as the walk of someone who is not uncertain about what they know, but who is uncertain about what to do with it. She had spent her life watching human nature operate in its everyday forms, the jealousies and kindnesses, the small betrayals and the large loyalties, the things people did when they thought no one was looking, and the things they did precisely because someone was. She had understood, for a very long time, that the worst things people did were rarely done by monsters. They were done by people who had a reason, and who told themselves the reason was sufficient, and who were sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and often both at once. Jean Hartley had not murdered her brother-in-law. She had gone to him with a truth and delivered it, and his body had made the decision his will had not yet reached. There was no pharmacological crime here, no deliberate mechanism of death. There was only a woman who had carried her dead husband's wound for 30 years, and had decided at last to lay it down at the feet of the man who had caused it. Whether the laying down had been an act of justice or an act of violence so refined as to have shed its visible weapons, this was the question Miss Marple had been walking with since she left Willow End, and she did not find it simple, and she did not think it should be. She knew several things with certainty. Robert Hartley had died of cardiac failure, and Dr. Fenwick's certificate was honest. She was satisfied that there was no poison, no physical interference, nothing that would survive a coroner's scrutiny. The death was, in the legal and physiological sense, natural. What was not natural, what was. In the fullest moral sense, a species of deliberate action was the confrontation that had precipitated it. A confrontation undertaken by a woman who knew, or should have known, what stress might do to a compromised heart. There was no crime that the law could usefully pursue here. And yet, Miss Marple sat in the sitting room of Lavender Cottage for the rest of Monday and through the Tuesday morning, and on Tuesday afternoon she went to see Mrs. Drummond again. She did not ask Mrs. Drummond anything further about the past. She told her, instead, in the careful, selective way of someone who understands that the whole truth is not always what a conversation can carry, that she had spoken to Jean Hartley, and that she believed Jean had come to Little Wickford to seek some form of accounting for the wrong done to Martin, and that she believed Robert's death was natural, and that Jean had been present when it happened and had felt she could not come forward. Mrs. Drummond listened to all of this without expression. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" Miss Marple said, "I'm not going to the police, because there is nothing the police can usefully do with what I know. But I think someone should know, and I think someone should speak to Jean about what comes next." "Mrs. Drummond said, after a silence, "she could have come to me." "She didn't know how much you knew," said Miss Marple, "and people who have carried a secret for a very long time often find it easier to confess to someone who doesn't belong to the landscape of the secret." Mrs. Drummond accepted this. She'll need to speak to the solicitor at some point. About the estate. She's family the nearest remaining if there are no children. "There are no children," said Miss Marple. I confirmed that. Mrs. Drummond looked at her with something between admiration and unease. "You've been very thorough. I've been trying to understand," said Miss Marple. "There's a difference. Understanding doesn't always produce a tidy result. The deduction, the assembling of it into a coherent form she could hold, came that evening, as such things often came to Miss Marple, not as a flash of inspiration, but as the recognition that she had already understood, and had only to articulate it. She was sitting by the fire in Mrs. Fellowes's sitting room, knitting in the late dusk, when she said Edith, "Did you know that Martin Hartley and Dorothy Hale were once that they nearly Mrs. Fellowes looked up from her book? Dorothy Hale? I was a child when she was here. I remember the name. There was some talk, but I was too young to follow it. Why? Do you know whatever happened to her? Goodness, Mrs. Fellowes thought. I believe she married eventually. Went to London, as I said. Mrs. Drummond would know." Miss Marple nodded. She thought about Dorothy Hale, who was perhaps in her late 50s now, who had spent her adult life without knowing what she had lost, who had written to Martin in his illness. Because old griefs do not entirely dissolve, she thought about what Dorothy's life might have been, and what it had been, and about the letter that had arrived in the blue envelope with its old-fashioned handwriting. She had assumed the letter was from Jean. Jean had confirmed it. But the handwriting had seemed older than Jean's 53 years. Miss Marple had thought about this, and had concluded that handwriting aged at different rates and been satisfied. Now she thought again. She said, very quietly, to herself rather than to Mrs. Fellowes, what if it was Dorothy herself? Mrs. Fellowes looked at her quizzically. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Thinking aloud," she said, but she thought. Jean had said she sent the letter, and she believed Jean, and she had the letter in her possession according to her own account. So either Jean had written it in a hand that looked older than she was, or, and this was the part that pulled at Miss Marple, the letter she had seen on the table that Monday, before Caroline took it round, was not the only letter. Jean had written to Robert. But had someone else written to him too? She let this thought move slowly through her. Martin had told Jean the truth about Robert before he died. Jean had Dorothy's letter to Martin among Martin's effects. Jean had written to Robert to confront him. But Dorothy, if Dorothy had also, at some point, written to Robert, directly written to him without Jean's knowledge, Miss Marple thought, it does not change the essential structure. Robert is dead of his heart, and Jean carries what she carries. Whether there was one letter or two, the mechanism is the same. The confrontation is the same. The result is the same. And yet she found herself, the following morning, writing a short letter to an address in London that Mrs. Drummond had provided after a telephone call of some delicacy, an address for Dorothy Hale, who had become, by marriage, Dorothy Fenwick, not the Dr. Fenwick of this village. But the coincidence of the name struck Miss Marple as the kind of coincidence that was not entirely accidental, and she stored it carefully. She wrote to Dorothy Fenwick. She said only that she was an elderly visitor to Little Wickford, who had reason to believe Dorothy had known the Hartley family in her youth, and that she wished, if Dorothy were willing, to ask a few questions about those days, as they might be relevant to the matter of Robert Hartley's recent death. She did not know if she would receive an answer. She turned instead to the object of the blue letter itself, its absence from the library, its presence in Jean Hartley's possession. She needed to know what it said, not for legal purposes, for her own. She went back to Willow End on Wednesday morning. Jean received her without surprise. She had, by this time, a quality of readiness about her, the readiness of someone who has made peace with being seen. "You want to read it," Jean said, and went to a drawer without being asked. The letter was 3 pages, in Jean's own handwriting, which was clear and deliberate and not especially old-fashioned, which settled at least one question. She had written it in ink, on blue notepaper, her own stationery, presumably, and the tone of it was what Miss Marple had expected from the woman she had now sat with twice, controlled, precise, devastating in the way that precision often is when it is applied to old wounds. She had written that she was in Little Wickford, that she had been there since September, that she had no intention of taking legal action or causing public scandal. She had written that she possessed Dorothy's letter to Martin, in which Dorothy had made clear what she had received in that September 30 years ago, not Martin's letter of love and intent, but Robert's letter of dismissal in Martin's name. She had written that she had spent 20 years watching Martin carry this, and that she did not hold Robert responsible for Martin's death, but held him responsible for the shape of Martin's life, for the best of what Martin might have been that had been quietly redirected into something lesser by one act of brotherly theft. She had written, "I am not asking for anything. I am telling you that Martin knew. I am telling you that I know. I am telling you that the concealment is over. I am telling you this because I believe you should spend the remainder of your life in the knowledge that you are known." It was not a kind letter, but it was a truthful one. Miss Marple read it twice. Then she folded it and returned it to Jean without comment. "He read this," she said. It was not a question. "I imagine he did," said Jean. "More than once, perhaps. And he called you?" "He called and hung up. Then he called again later that day and left a message I wasn't in. He said he needed to speak to me, that there were things he needed to say." But she stopped. "He said he was sorry." On the message. "I deleted it before I thought to keep it. He said he was sorry and that he had been sorry for a long time and that he didn't expect it to mean anything." Miss Marple was quiet. "And then you went to him that night." "I went to hear what he would say in person, what a man will say when he can't hang up." Jean's voice was not cruel, but it was without forgiveness. "He said the same things. He said he'd been sorry since the day he did it. He said he'd told himself it was for Martin's good, and had known almost immediately that it wasn't. He said he'd been afraid of the estrangement all his life, and had never found the way back through it." "Did you believe him?" "Yes," said Jean. "I believed him, and it made no difference to anything." She said this last sentence in the simple way of stating a physical fact, a law of the world, as immovable as the cold. Miss Marple thought about Martin Hartley, who had lived in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and carried the shape of a summer inside him. She thought about Robert, who had carried the knowledge of what he had done, 30 years of it, wrapped in respectability and civic virtue, and the quiet, dignified architecture of a man who has buried something and built carefully over the grave. She thought, small details reveal large truths. The small detail was a letter that was never delivered. The large truth was 2 lives deflected from their courses by one moment of cowardice and jealousy dressed up as concern. "What will you do?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't know yet," said Jean. I feel she paused. I feel that I have done something I cannot entirely justify, and something I cannot entirely regret. I went there to speak the truth, and the truth did what the truth sometimes does. She looked at the window. Martin is still dead. Dorothy is still somewhere in London living a life that was chosen for her by someone else. None of that is changed. "No," said Miss Marple. "None of that is changed." They sat together in Willow End for a while, the old woman and the middle-aged one, in the November light, and neither of them spoke about what came next, because neither of them knew. And that, Miss Marple thought, was itself a kind of truth. Chapter 7. By morning, everything had already changed. November deepened, and the village of Little Wickford adjusted itself around the fact of Robert Hartley's death in the way that villages always do, with the careful, practical, incremental work of incorporation. The death became part of the fabric. The like gate he had donated acquired a new significance, a small patina of memorial. Mrs. Bassett found new employment with the Ramsdens. The solicitor from Oxbury came and went, and came again, and the copper beech at Hartley Hall stood bare against the winter sky, dark and leafless, and somehow more architectural than it had been with its autumn crown, as though the stripping away had revealed its actual structure. Jean Hartley stayed in Little Witchford through November. This surprised some people, and did not surprise others. Mrs. Drummond did not seem surprised at all, and had taken to having Jean to tea on Thursday afternoons, and what they spoke of Miss Marple did not know. But she thought it was probably something of the history that Mrs. Drummond had, in her keeping the history of Martin as a young man, Martin as a boy. The Martin that Jean had not known until she found it living in the angles of the man she had married. These Thursday teas had, Miss Marple understood, a restorative quality. Not the quick restoration of comfort administered, but the slower kind, the kind that comes from sitting with someone who knew a person you loved when they were young and whole, before the damage, and hearing them described as they were then, easy in themselves, bright-eyed, not yet bent. Jean had known Martin only as the man he had become after that summer, and Mrs. Drummond could offer her the boy before it, the young man before it, the Martin who had sat in this same village and watched swallows and wanted home. It was, Miss Marple thought, a form of restoration for the village too. The knowledge carried quietly, shared only between those who now held it, that Robert Hartley had not been simply the respectable man he appeared. That behind the Lick Gate and the parish council meetings and the donations and the careful dignity, there had been a private architecture of an entirely different kind. Not monstrous, she was insistent about this in her own mind, not monstrous, but human, comprehensibly human, the kind of thing that people did and then spent the rest of their lives building things over. Miss Marple received a letter on the 10th of November. It was from Dorothy Fenwick, Nahale, of an address in Shepherd's Bush. It was written in the handwriting of an elderly woman not 58, which would have been Dorothy's age, but the hand of someone who had aged faster than her years, perhaps from illness or from the particular fatigue of a long life. The handwriting was old-fashioned and written with some force, and Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment before she opened it. Dorothy Fenwick wrote that she had received Miss Marple's letter, and had been both startled and relieved by it. She wrote, written to Robert Hartley in October, had written to him on behalf of no one but herself, and had said only this, that she had found, among the papers of a recently deceased mutual acquaintance from their Bristol days, a letter. A letter in Martin Hartley's handwriting, dated in the summer 30 years ago, addressed to herself. Unopened, sealed, it had been in the deceased's files for 3 decades, she wrote, with a brief note in a handwriting she had identified as Robert's, asking the friend to keep it safely and never to speak of it. Robert had given his friend the letter to keep as a kind of insurance, or a kind of penance, she did not speculate on which, only that it had been kept all this time. And that the friend had died, and that in the clearing of effects it had been found by a daughter who had recognised the name Hartley and sent it on to Dorothy through the slow, uncertain process of the recently bereaved. Dorothy had opened the letter. She had read Martin's words written 30 years ago on a summer evening when the swallows were flying and everything had been ahead of him. She had sat with them for a week. And then she had written to Robert, very simply, only to tell him that she had it, and that she had read it, and that she had loved Martin once with her whole young heart, and that she forgave him nothing but understood that he had lived with it. Miss Marple set the letter down on the kitchen table and was still for several minutes. 2 letters then, Jean's and Dorothy's, arriving in the same week, perhaps the same day, the one from the woman who had married him, and the one from the woman he had lost. Both of them carrying the same knowledge, both of them making the same announcement, it is known, and the concealment is over, and nothing can be done for what was lost. Robert Hartley had received both of these. He had sat in his library with them, with the weight of them, with 30 years of a secret that had never been large enough to be fully buried, and had coloured everything: his solitude, his civic virtue, his respectability, his refusal to look too closely at his own past. He had sat there with the brandy and the dead fire, and his heart had been already weak, and when Jean had come at 9 o'clock to speak the truth aloud, Miss Marple folded Dorothy's letter and held it. She thought, this is not a mystery in the way I have known mysteries. There is no murderer to expose, no crime to prove. There is only the accumulated weight of a lie, and the moment when a human heart was asked to bear that weight openly and could not. She thought, by morning, everything had already changed. Not on Thursday morning when Mrs. Bassett found him. Earlier, on a morning 30 years ago in a Bristol corridor where Robert Hartley had held his brother's letter and had made a decision in a fraction of a second. The kind of decision that one tells oneself is not entirely a decision that circumstances made. That could be undone later, but wasn't. That was the morning after which everything had been different, had been bent, had been growing in its altered direction toward the autumn in a quiet village where 2 women had finally spoken what they knew. She went to Mrs. Fellowes that evening and said she would be returning to St. Mary Mead at the end of the week. Mrs. Fellowes said she was sorry to lose her, and that the village had been the better for her presence, and would she come again next year? Miss Marple said she rather thought she would. She went the following morning to Willow End. Jean was making tea when she arrived, and they sat in the small sitting room with the fire lit and the duck pond visible through the window, still and pale. Miss Marple had brought Dorothy's letter, and she gave it to Jean without preface. Jean read it. She read it slowly, the whole of it, and when she finished, she did not speak for some time. On the mantelpiece, the photograph of the man who was not Rob at the harbour behind him, the younger Jean beside him, the water that looked like it could be Bristol or Glasgow or any harboured city, where a man with a bent life had still managed to love something, stood in its frame in the November light. "She's well?" Jean asked. "She appears to be," said Miss Marple. "Her handwriting suggests someone who has had some difficulty, but the mind behind it is clear and steady." Jean held the letter for a moment longer, and then she set it on her knee with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something they intend to keep. "Martin never knew about her letter," she said. "That she'd found his. He died before it reached her." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "He died not knowing she'd received it. He died still in the still at the distance Robert had created." Jean's voice was steady, but she knows now. She read his words. She did. Jean closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were not wet, but had a quality of completion in them, like a sentence finally finished. "That's something," she said. That matters, that after all of it, she got to read what he actually said." Miss Marple thought, yes, that is something. The letter, which had waited in a dead man's files for 30 years, had finally arrived. 30 years late, taken the long way, through grief and estate papers and a stranger's hands, but arrived. The object that had begun all of this, the blue envelope on Mrs. Fellow's kitchen table had been, she understood now, only the most recent in a series. There had always been letters at the centre of this story, and they had always been about whether the truth would reach the person for whom it was intended. Robert's life's work had been to prevent that arrival, and in the end, the truth had arrived anyway, as it tends to do. With the stubborn patience of things that exist in writing, they wait. "What will you do?" Miss Marple asked. "I'm going to write to Dorothy," Jean said. "I think we should know each other. I think Martin would have wanted." She stopped and adjusted. "I think it would be good for both of us." "I think so too," said Miss Marple. "And the estate there will be things to handle with the solicitor. Martin's share of what their father left was never settled properly. There may be something there, or there may not. I'm not doing it for money." She paused. "I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing it for." "Completion, perhaps completion," said Miss Marple, "is not a small thing." She walked to Hartley Hall that afternoon alone. The solicitor had not yet locked it, and the garden was accessible, and she stood for a while under the copper beech, which was entirely bare now, all its dark red given to the ground. The leaves were thick and moist underfoot, the dark rust of them. She looked up through the bare branches at the November sky, which was the same pewter and ash it had been on her first day in the village, as though the sky here had settled on a single mood and saw no reason to deviate. She thought about Robert Hartley as a young man, which she had not previously done. She thought about him at 27 or 28, holding his brother's letter, feeling whatever he had felt in that moment, jealousy perhaps, or the simpler and more terrible thing, which was love for his brother refracted through the conviction that he knew better. The damage we do in the name of knowing better. The letter in his hand. The decision. She was not without sympathy for him, and she did not pretend to be. She had known enough of human nature to understand that people who do great damage are rarely doing it in full awareness of what they are doing. They are doing something smaller, something that feels local and manageable, and the great damage is what it becomes over time. Robert had not destroyed 2 lives that September morning. He had only taken an action that seemed, to him, corrective. The destruction came later, in increments out of sight. He had been sorry, Jane had said. He had been sorry since almost immediately after. Miss Marple thought, that is its own punishment, and perhaps it is sufficient, and perhaps it is not. And she was not in a position to adjudicate, and she did not try. She walked back through the village in the early dusk, and the lights were coming on in the cottages, amber and warm through old glass, and the elms along the high street were bare, and the duck pond was still, and everything had the quality of a place that has arrived at the end of something and is resting in it. She stopped at the village shop and bought a postcard, one of those simple ones, a photograph of the church tower, the kind that says only, "I was here." She would send it to her niece. It would arrive, as such things do, a little late, a little out of context, but it would arrive. On her last morning in Little Wickford she walked out early, before the village was quite awake, in the cold November half-light when the frost was still on the lane and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold earth. She walked along Church Lane and then along the field path and then back through the village, and she felt, as she often felt at the end of things, the particular calm of having understood rather than merely solved which were not the same, and she had spent enough of her life mistaking them to value the difference. She thought about Jean Hartley, who would write to Dorothy, and about Dorothy, who had read at last what Martin had written. She thought about Martin, who had not known, and who was dead, and who was in some sense no longer a character in any story, but the loved centre of several, which is not a nothing. She thought about the copper beech, bare against the sky, standing as it had stood since Robert's grandfather planted it as a sapling, containing the whole Hartley history in its rings, the growth and the loss, the presence and the absence, the long patient life of something rooted. She thought, by morning, everything had already changed. Mornings do that, all of them, quietly, while we sleep. The world that wakes is never exactly the world that slept. We only notice on the days when the change is large, but it is always happening. in the small adjustments and the quiet exchanges, in the letters that travel and the truths that wait and the hearts that are always. Beneath the respectability and the careful dignity, doing the complicated human work of carrying what they have done. She passed the like gate with its brass plate and its careful stonework. She passed the war memorial. She passed the post box, pillar box red and reliable in the early light. At the gate of Lavender Cottage she stopped and looked back along the lane, at the village she had known for 5 weeks and would, she thought, remember all her life. Not because anything dramatic had happened here. It had not. A man had died, and the truth had travelled a long way to reach him. And the truth had arrived after all, and there was grief in that, and something that was not quite justice, but was in the same neighbourhood as justice, the quiet neighbourhood, the one with no monuments or ceremonies, only the slow acknowledgement that what happened, happened, and cannot be undone, and the living must continue. She went inside and packed her bag with the neat efficiency of a woman who has always known what she needed and never much more. She left Little Wickford on a Friday morning in the pale late autumn light, with her knitting bag and her small suitcase and the particular thoughtfulness of someone who has understood something that matters and knows it will stay with her. Mrs. Fellows stood at the gate and waved. Mrs. Pritchard, from the kitchen window, raised a hand. At the end of Church Lane, where the fields began, a last few starlings turned against the sky in the murmuration of their going, dark against the white, moving together in the old way that has no explanation but is never other than beautiful. Miss Marple watched them until they were gone. Then she turned toward the road, and the village fell quietly behind her, and the morning light lay over everything, and it was, like all mornings, already changed. Et end est candlelight mystery.